Hello and welcome to the Game Developers Library, a new podcast all about books about game design or books which might help you understand game design better, even if they're not directly about game design. Our first book is very much about game design. It is about a specific game being designed by the author. I'm Joe Baxter Webb from the Indie Game Clinic. You may know me from my YouTube channel, and I am joined today by guest host Tom Hughes.
Hello, how you going?
Tom, hello. You are joining me today to talk about Derek Yu's Spelunky book.
I am, and I'm very excited about it. It's a book I've got a lot of feelings, mostly feelings about.
And you were the person who actually suggested this book when we got the first sort of lineup of hosts together, and I asked people about books they'd like to talk about. What made you pick this book, kind of generally?
Well, there's lots of reasons. Like, one, it's kind of got like a bit of a cult reputation in indie game circles, so I wanted to make sure I jumped on it quickly, so I was the one that got it. But yeah, it's one of those books that there aren't a lot of, where it's indie or a game creator of any kind sort of writing about their own work. You get lots of books like, Masters of Doom, which sort of have this almost journalistic, recounting narrative to them. Whereas this is a creator sort of interrogating themselves and their own design decisions and, reflecting on all the things they learnt along the way.
Yeah, and I must admit I hadn't read it yet. It had been on my to-do list for a long time, which, to be honest, is part of the reason for doing this podcast, is to make myself read more books from design theory and other areas of kind of game development related stuff. Because when I went to grad school, it kind of killed my love for reading. And then the last couple of years, I've only been able to force myself to read like pulp. So I thought this would be a good reason to get back to this stuff. And one of the things I've noticed online, sort of watching a lot of people develop games and stuff, is that people don't seem to be super up on their game design literature. So I thought maybe doing this podcast would be a helpful service to people, because you get the kind of gist of a book, and then from that you can go and work out if you want to read it yourself. Because we're going to go through the book and kind of work through it loosely in chronological order, but we're not going to cover every single thing. And the benefit of having people like yourself on the podcast as guests is we can kind of assess how practical the book is, I guess. Anything from the book that we kind of think might be particularly helpful to new developers, or anything that kind of gave us a fresh insight. Because you're a developer as well, right?
Yep, I've got a day job as a game developer, and then I have my own projects that I work on in the evening. So game dev by day, game dev by night.
Yeah, so those who've been watching Indie Game Clinic on YouTube for a while will have seen a brief snippet of Tom's game Castle Croak. It's like kind of like Worms, but a mobile version with frogs. And it appeared very, very briefly in one of my videos when I made a theme tune for Tom.
Thank you for that theme song. That was great.
an unsolicited theme tune. I don't do it often, but I really like that game. It's not going to be out for a while, is it? But because you have to do netcode, which
that multiplies the amount of time that it takes to take a game out.
To do anything. Yeah,
don't make multiplayer games.
And that it does actually come up in the book. So if people are listening and they're unfamiliar with Spelunky, it really was a kind of special game when it came out. And it came out first as this kind of free web version that was like a pixel art game. And then later it got remade initially for Xbox Live Arcade. And the narrative of the book kind of takes us through all those stages. And we kind of get this story of like how you end up making a platformer that's also got this kind of roguelike generation and stuff as well, which might not seem that unusual now because we've seen kind of various games that use that format, but at the time it was an unusual mix. So just to kind of start off at the beginning, and as you said, this is an unusual book because it is the designer talking about their own work. And that means we get a lot of kind of context of what Derek Yu was doing before that. So we've got a couple of games before that he made, like Aquaria, stuff working in something called the Click and Play community, which was like a pre-game maker game maker type thing.
Yeah, sort of very early but accessible game engine.
Yeah, and Derek Yu's background is very much like a visual artist who enjoys game design and can program things himself, but sort of sees the programming part as a kind of necessary evil type thing rather than something enjoyable.
Yeah, that's sort of like one of the things that, you know, made me feel like a kindred spirit to Derek Yu a little bit, because I felt like I had the same starting position as him, and then I sort of like pushed past the hating programming thing, and that became my thing. And I was never good at the art side, so. But yeah, I felt seen by that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think lots of people will be in a similar position. And yeah, you get this early kind of discussion of what he'd done before before Spelunky. He had a reasonably interesting career before that with Aquaria. And then Spelunky kind of came out of these experiments with two different genres and sort of liking platformers and liking certain aspects of roguelikes and also having problems with both those genres. And I think it's only about 10 pages into the book, but you get this sort of realization that the two genres can help each other, right?
Yeah, I think it's in the first section where he has that really interesting metaphor about the creative process being like puzzle pieces, and as you sort of absorb different things in life, they become these puzzle pieces, and when you create something new, you try and put the pieces together and see which ones fit. And yeah, I thought that was like a elegant metaphor for what he did with Spelunky.
Yeah, yeah. He talks about basically not liking certain aspects of roguelikes, like in order to beat them, you had to learn all of these strange techniques, like something called polypiling, where you clone items or something.
Yeah.
And then with being more drawn to platformers because he enjoyed sort of reactive action-based games, but not liking the fact that you had to play the same level over and over and again. And you get this whole sequence where he's sort of thinking about these two problems and not really putting it together for a while, and then it clicks, and then he's like, "Oh, hang on, these can sort each other out," which I thought was really interesting as a starting point, because I look at lots of people's games for the channel, and one of the things I notice a lot of the time is people put together things they like and they sort of try and do a genre mashup or whatever you want to call it, but sometimes it doesn't feel like they've thought about why those things go together other than just I like them.
Yeah, like, I mean, sometimes it's almost a better place to start with, a thing that you don't like and try and work out what the thing that would fix that problem would be.
Yes, yeah. So it's like problem-based design kind of approach, because that's what industrial design usually looks like, right? It's like we want to make a chair that's the cheapest chair possible. We want to make a chair that's the most durable chair possible. That's kind of like problem-based design. And I think often, yeah, as you say, like it's easier to pick something you don't like about a genre of games and design around trying to fix that than it is to just go, I want to replicate the thing I like.
Yeah, and I think that's the trap is like people get excited about the things they like and they want to replicate that. But then you end up putting these things together that nice in isolation, but it's like putting gravy on ice cream, and doesn't make it better.
Yeah, and even if you're not putting things together, the thing you like is probably beyond what you can do, because it was made by 30 to 300 people. So if you say, "Oh, I really like Diablo," it's like, well, good job, good luck making a Diablo killer on your own. But if you can pick something that you really don't like, then you're solving a problem which is going to lead to something that's innovative. And I've talked before about aiming for innovation, and sometimes people come back and they say not everything has to be innovative. Sometimes you can just make something of a very high quality, and it's like, yeah, but I'm talking mostly to solo developers, right?
Yeah.
And trying to be innovative is usually a better route to success for a solo developer, because you can't stand out based on like quality and polish if you're one person on your own.
Yeah, like unless you're like a fantastic artist and then the art of your game is the thing that sells it, then maybe. But yeah, I think you're better off trying to do something that people haven't experienced before. And
one of the things that comes up quite early in this book as well. So the whole first section is about developing the first Spelunky, which is not the version that a lot of people will have played. It was the original pixel art version, slightly different in some ways, had some kind of stuff missing from it if you compare it to the Xbox version. But there's a lot of talk about how the kind of playtesting for that happened as well, because he was part of TIGsource.
Yeah,
the
I think
game source.
he took over the forum at a certain point.
Yes.
That's where I found the original version of Spelunky way back in the day.
Yeah, so he'd been on there for a while, talking to people about their projects and so on, and there were ways of sort of creating private areas of the forum where you could share a demo with just some people. And the kind of centrality of community to the development of this game is really interesting, because you think of it as like a one-man show to a degree, and then later there's another programmer and stuff like that. But yeah, he's part of TIGsource. He's sharing it on there. Eventually, the guy who set up TIGsource wants to retire, and then Derek Yu sort of takes over as that. So he's always got this big pool of playtesters, which is an interesting thing to note as well for developers, I think, because your game is only going to be as good as the amount of playtests it's had, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people focus on just like, I'll make the game, put it out, then how do I get visibility? And it's like, well, you should be worrying about that before you've even finished, because you should be trying to get it tested like by 100 different people before you even start thinking of it as a product,
Yeah, and that's another reason that I like this book, is because it's kind of a little bit of a counter narrative to what game development at that time was seeing, because it's around the same time that Indie Game the movie came out, and it's the story of these individual or two-man teams of developers, and the way it's sort of presented is like it's them against the world, and they're building these things in isolation. But no, at the time, like, there were these communities like TIGsource and like the Newgrounds forums, and these places on the internet where small groups of like-minded small creators were exchanging ideas, working on each other's games, collaborating, and talking about games.
Yeah, it's the narrative around that kind of initial indie boom is often that it was kind of easier then because there were less games. That's kind of what a younger person or someone who's just getting into the scene now often sees it in terms of. It's like, it's harder now because there are more games, and that's the reason why it's hard to get noticed. And it's like, well, the games from the original indie boom were really high quality, and they were made by people, in the case of Derek Yu, he's had 2 reasonably successful games before that. In the case of, Meat Boy and Binding of Isaac, Ed McMillan has made something like 30 or 40 Flash games before those.
Yeah.
So these are really experienced people. Jonathan Blow was really experienced. Lucas Pope was really experienced. And as you say, this book is a counter narrative. And as we get through it, there will be, spoiler alert, Jonathan Blow shows up in this story in quite a critical role at one point as well. So there's all of these interactions and rubbing shoulders with people who were successful at the time or went on to be successful later and so on. But yeah, the first section, before we jump too far ahead, you get a lot of just really good sort of broad design thinking about mechanics and themes. There's a section here about the theme of it being like a pulp adventure Indiana Jones type thing, and he talks about themes as a lubricant to help you understand the rules of a game, which is quite cool, right? And this is like game design 101 type stuff, but there's so much about the theme that just makes cartoon bombs and climbing up a rope and using a whip, and all of this kind of makes sense.
Yeah, or just the whole concept of continually climbing down further and further into the game.
Yeah, and he talks about how that solves some of the problems with the procedural generation, because it's harder to procedurally generate something that the player can climb up. Yeah. But if they're just going down, then it's less difficult to generate around, and then the bombs also provide a kind of get out of jail free card if the procedural generation makes something really difficult.
If you're going in the same direction as gravity, then the physics is literally pulling you in the direction you're supposed to go.
Yeah. And that's interesting as well because again, I see lots of people making games with procedural generation in where it feels like it's just to kind of create a static level that is different each time, but not in a way that really impacts the gameplay in any interesting way.
Yeah, and like I mean, you see examples of like bad procedural generation, even like the AAA level. Like I think with like Starfield, where they were procedurally generating entire planets, where every planet was unique, but there was nothing on it.
Yeah.
Whereas Derek came up with like a really sort of interesting way where he was still designing like the chunks that made up the larger level, which gave him some authorial control over it, without just letting the algorithm take the wheel and probably ending up with something a lot blander and
Yeah, I
less
mean,
fun.
we saw the same thing happen with No Man's Sky, didn't we? Where it was
Yeah.
much more kind of porridgey at the start, and Starfield is an interesting comparison because they're both big space games, but Starfield is made by a AAA studio that can't work on a thing indefinitely, whereas No Man's Sky is the kind of thing where it's like, well, it had been worked on for years before release, and then after release it can be worked on for years more because that's indie studios often become like one product studios and they can iterate and iterate. But yeah, like having a procedural generation that is aimed at giving the player a particular type of experience rather than just sort of creating variety in background dressing is really challenging, and there's a lot of that here. There's a really good quote. He's kind of quoting Shigeru Miyamoto from Nintendo, and it comes up multiple times through the book as well. And the quote is, "A good idea is something that does not solve just one single problem, but rather can solve multiple problems at once."
Yeah, I want that as a tattoo.
Yeah.
It's just really
big
good
big
advice,
picture of Miyamoto's
Yeah.
face with that underneath it. And this comes up lots and lots of times. So there's a passage here on page 33. Spelunky was both my easiest development and also most popular project to date, and I believe it's because the key elements, the theme, the random level generation, and the destructible terrain worked together without friction. Nothing was compromised to make something else fit, and each part only boosted the signal of the other parts. We're spelunking, we're going down into a cave. The procedural generation and the kind of going down through the levels makes sense. The bombs allow you to kind of break the level, which helps with the procedural generation and making that softer. The fact that it's in caves means that he talks about abstraction and why we use caves and dungeons in games, and it's like the whole you don't have to worry about where the toilet is or where the fire exit is and stuff like that. As soon as you're procedurally generating an office block, then the expectation of it adhering to some like real world thing is much higher. You know?
I guess what he's really talking about there is like game design pillars. Like, when you're designing a game, these are like, you'll end up making changes and iterations and things, but these are like the core things that like aren't going to change because that's what the game is. And, getting those pillars right at the start of a project just makes everything easier because it gives you like a lodestar that you can keep pointing your game back towards whenever you're going down the garden path.
Yeah, and with Spelunky, a lot of it is this kind of broad tonal thing of it being playful and cartoony, which helps take the edge off of it being like punishingly difficult, right? Because it's like it's kind of the same thing that Meat Boy had, actually. That same quality of like, this game is going to kick your ass a bunch of times, but it's going to kind of do it with a smile.
Well, it's going to kick your ass quickly and send you back so you can try again.
Yeah. We get like a whole section on the way the levels are randomized, and one of the things that jumped out to me multiple times in this book is that I don't consider myself a programmer or a very proficient programmer. I can do it when I really want to, but a lot of the methods that Derek Hugh talks about here are the way I would have done it. These kind of hacky ways they're not sophisticated. They're just the quickest way to get to a solution to the problem. And the problem is usually a game design problem of like, how do I make the player able to do this or not able to do this, rather than like some elegant thing or something aimed at realism or any of that. So we get the rules for the randomized levels. It's like you start at the top, you go to the bottom. There must be a clear route through the level.
So I think if I remember it correctly, he basically starts on like the top row. So it's like a 4x4 grid. He starts at one of those squares on the top row and then does a couple of rolls to see if we're moving left or right on that row. And on a particular roll, it will move down. So that way we've got like a definite route between the start and the next level. And he basically keeps doing that until he gets to the bottom row and then picks one of those to be the exit.
Yeah.
Which again, yeah, it's it's probably the way that I'd do it as well.
Yeah. So if you think of there's that route through those chunks of the level, and then everything else can basically be anything else. And sometimes that means that those things will naturally open up into the caves that you pass through on the Golden Path. And sometimes they just don't. So you would have to use a bomb, or maybe it's an entrance that you can only get into from below, so you'd have to use a rope. But he sort of set this rule that the kind of Golden Path only matters to get from the entrance to the exit, and everything else can potentially generate in a kind of impassable way, and that's where the kind of bombs and ropes come in. And that's really neat, and it's a really good example of doing a thing that's kind of easy for yourself to implement that also achieves a design goal,
Yeah, well, I mean, the other tattoo I'm going to get next to my Miyamoto one is this, the rule of my career is like, players don't see the code. So,
Yes.
You can write the most clever thing in the world, but, all the players are going to see is a cave.
Yeah.
And, if you've got a way to design an interesting cave that isn't, mathematically sophisticated, then, you've done the right thing.
Yeah, and if you think, so if people haven't played Spelunky, there are 4 areas, pretty much like Binding of Isaac or most of these games. There are 4 kind of areas that are sort of different biomes, and in Spelunky it's the mines, the jungles, the ice caves, and then what was the last one? The temple, the city.
Yeah, it's like
I've reached
City of
like
Gold.
once
Yeah.
because I'm terrible at this game, and in that kind of context, it matters less that your cave looks like a cave, and the thing that actually matters is when you get to a different area, does it feel different, or is it just a palette swap?
Yeah.
And the thing that we get a lot of in Spelunky is there is a different generator for each, or there's different segments. Because if you want to imagine it in the simplest way possible, if you imagine someone like drawing cards from a deck and laying out a grid of them, whether it's 4x3 or whatever, and then turning them over and they've got bits of the level in, and then some of that inside gets randomized, right? When you get to the ice caves, what's on those cards is like dramatically different because there's lots of big hanging gaps and just platforms in the air and stuff like that. So we get a lot of description of this. We get some code snippets talking about, when I put a little monster on the level, what is it going to be? And showing you some of the randomization that happens. And another thing that might put people's mind at ease if they're doing this themselves is just how much of it is trial and error, and how much he's open about that. Which is a theme that comes up a lot in other things I've read by sort of quote unquote veteran developers as well. Like even with big multiplayer games, I heard an interview about the original StarCraft, and people asking like, how did you balance this? What's the big? They want there to be some sort of magic formula.
Yeah.
Because you see it, don't you? You find websites that are like how to balance an RTS, and it's all these diagrams with triangles and putting things on a triangle, and it was like, no, it was we built a system so that we could change variables really quickly, and we played, and then we changed the variables, and then we played, and then we changed the variables. And it's the same thing here with all of the randomization of like how frequently different enemies show up. It's just the sort of thing that you try and make it easy to change, and then you just tweak it every time you play.
That's like the human part of design. Like my strategy is usually to make the number really big, and then when that doesn't feel right, make it really small, and then if that doesn't work, or make it big but not quite as big as that first time. And if you keep going back and forth like that, you can kind of find the sweet spot.
Yeah, Sid Meier had a quote of something along those lines that was like always double or half it.
Yeah.
Which is it's kind of like if you're tuning a guitar, when you first put a string on a guitar, you don't like make tiny little increments because it's a new string. You do massive changes, and then when it's close to the note it's supposed to be at, that's when you can start making small increments. But yeah, we do. It's very easy to kind of fall into this early tuning of something when you don't really know what the game is really going for. So yeah, in this early chapter we get all of the description of the game being playtested on TIGsource, which is quite interesting. and there is like a story in there of a particular playtester getting very frustrated with the game because it was too difficult.
Yeah, I remember that one, and I think that's like an interesting point. And I think also comes up a couple of times in the games is like, what do you take away from QA testers, and is the customer, or in this case the player, always right? And I think he thinks no.
Yeah, and that's another thing that you get throughout this book is a real strong sense of the designer's sort of ethos of like what he enjoys expressing through games and what he wants players to get out of the games, because this is there are some elements in Spelunky that follow over between runs, but it is more in the traditional roguelike vein of you're not playing to grind for resources, you're playing to try and complete the game, and you'll learn something about how to complete the game each time, or what not to do, or whatever. And that kind of goes all the way through this. But there was a really interesting sort of discussion here about this player who got really frustrated with the game being too hard. And it's all about interpreting feedback and what do you do with that. Because what he eventually realised was that player could get better at the game, but he was actually giving valid criticism of, accessibility stuff to do with the controls. And there were certain things to do with how the controls worked, where it was like, oh, this requires 3 button presses and it should only require 2 or something like that. So interpreting the feedback, and when someone says something too hard, it's like, well, what is, I'm not going to change the difficulty of the game from my perspective because it's supposed to be a hard game. But when they say it's too hard, is it that they don't understand something and they need more information? Or is it that the controls aren't as simple as they could be for doing that thing? And he comes up with this brilliant, this brilliant metaphor. It was, if we were talking about the game of tennis instead of Spelunky, it's as though the player asked me to remove the net because he was having trouble hitting the ball over it. Right, so get rid of the challenge because I can't do the challenge. Neither of us realizing that the real problem was that I gave him a racket with broken strings.
Yeah.
So it's like everything you're doing at the front end of the game with the interface, with the controls. And this is why it's so important to be able to watch people play when you play test a game, because I've always found that when people have those kind of UX problems with the game, they don't get on with the controls. That's not the sort of thing that people are very good at communicating themselves. You have to watch them.
Yeah.
Because we sort of overwrite the memory, don't we? Like when you get over that thing and you can do it, you don't really remember that you had a problem. So
yeah, and especially if you're the person that made that thing in the first place, like there's a layer of abstraction between what the game's actually doing under the hood and what the user interface is. And if you put that in there, you kind of got the insider knowledge of like what this is supposed to do. You've probably been developing it for weeks or months, so you've just gotten used to that thing. And then when you put it in front of a completely fresh player and they struggle with it, then there's a disconnect there.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, this is kind of playtesting that's happening over TIGsource, so not necessarily situations where he can watch the playtesters and find out what the issue is. But I know there will be people listening to this and saying, yeah, it's all right for you to say it's really hard to get playtesters, and this is why these kind of communities are so important, because if you're in a design community, then you have people that want their games playtested and you can mutually playtest for each other. And it's not the same as having, random gamers playtest stuff. You'll get different insights, but all of this stuff that happened, before Spelunky became a commercial project and it was just floating around on the forums for people to playtest, that was only possible because of this community and TIGsource being full of other people that were really nerdy about indie games and wanting to try a new thing,
Yeah, it's the sort of concept of a game development scene, which has changed a lot. Like back in the day where, the internet was different and it wasn't just social media, you had these forums, and that's kind of like what the scene was. And like, I think the modern equivalent of that's probably Discord servers.
Yeah.
But people can change ideas. But yeah, sort of going back to the, the interaction with this one QA tester, I think sort of the golden rule there is like the feeling of the player's always correct, but the reason they give for it isn't necessarily always right, and that's sort of the problem to solve in the design of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very easy to just take everything totally to heart even when you're not new, right? When you're because we go to playtests with games, then we know, like the rational part of our brain knows that we're there to try and improve the thing by getting feedback. But there's always a part of you that just wants everyone to like it and think, it's perfect.
Yeah.
And it's like,
my job is done.
inside you are two wolves.
Yeah.
One of them wants your game to be better, and the other one wants treats and to be called a good boy. There's another section in this earlier bit about the shopkeeper. So you have a shopkeeper in Spelunky. It's interesting because they've just turned score and currency into a single resource, right? So you get you get a high score when you die based on how much gold you had at the end. So you can spend the gold on power-ups and stuff that are going to make it considerably easier, like jetpacks and things like that, but it does take away from your score. You can go into the shop and buy stuff from the shopkeeper, but you can also steal from him, which is an idea that he's taken from the old school roguelikes like Rogue and NetHack, where they had a shop and you can like go in and take stuff out. And the description of the logic for the shopkeeper is fantastic here, because again, it just reminds me of the sort of hacky approach I would take.
Yeah.
If you anger the shopkeeper, he starts leaping around shooting everything with a shotgun, and there is no real pathfinding for what he's doing. It's not like so he every now and his attack AI is every now and then turn towards the player.
Yep.
Every now and then fire my shotgun at the player if they're close enough and I have the shotgun. If the player is below me and not too far away from me horizontally, do nothing. Otherwise, if there's an obstacle directly in front of me, jump. Otherwise, if the player is above me, jump. And it talks about how this kind of gets the shopkeeper unstuck if he falls down a hole, but he's not like lethally smart like the alien in Isolation, like hunting you down. And also the way that it's based around him bouncing around trying to get out of holes and jump up to you and shoot you and stuff makes him seem really like aggressive.
Yeah, and if you've played Spelunky and pissed off the shopkeeper like that, you sort of know just how dangerous he is, even with like that very simple logic.
Yeah, I having shopkeeper flashbacks now. Again, it's just a really good example of how, this is a book written by a game designer who is an artist and can program, but he's not doing it as a programming exercise. All of the programming is there to serve the game, and it's such a good counterpoint to the type of advice people can end up getting if they fall into certain circles, right? Because wherever you go on the internet, whether it's like the Reddit, the game dev Reddit, or like the forums for Unity or Unreal or whatever, there are always people there who are predominantly software engineers.
Yeah.
And they want you to do things the proper way.
Yeah. Well, I think it comes down to like the platform again, like Unity running on Mono with like C# that attracts like a much more software engineering type person, whereas like Game Maker or Flash or any of those, or Click and Play, like those older ones where it is all just they've got their own scripting language. That's amateurs exchanging advice with other amateurs in these forums, which means it tends to be more about the design rather than the implementation.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't thought of that before, but yeah, that makes total sense. So communities like Game Maker and RPG Maker, and people are there because they want to make a game. They're not there because it's like a mix of people who want to make a game and people who know C# and want to do something else with it.
No, it's people that have an idea and want to give it a red hot go.
Yeah. We get a lot of background context about kind of use background in games, like playing arcade games, which I think is interesting because it kind of gives a different historical context for run-based games, right? Run-based games are really popular now to the point where anything that is a run-based game gets called a roguelike, even if the random stuff is really, really kind of weak. But yeah, we get discussion of Zelda, like very supportive parents that played games with him.
Yeah, he's got all those stories about playing, the original Zelda with his dad and like drawing out maps with him, and that seemed like quite a formative experience for him.
Yeah, and coming back to that idea of like problem-based design, there's a whole section of here about how Zelda lost its way, and
Which is interesting because I like had to have a look at when this book came out, and it was just before Breath of the Wild was
Right.
released. So I wonder if his opinion sort of changed when that came out, because that felt more that sort of you've got an open world that
yeah,
you need to find your own way in.
yeah, the sort of he's talking about the magic of the original Zelda being in sort of how obtuse it was, and how it was like a departure for Nintendo to make a game that didn't tell you how to play it.
Yeah.
And yeah, like over time, before Breath of the Wild, Zelda had slid into this thing of basically following the accessibility orthodoxy that all AAA games were going into, of like the game needs to tell you what to do at every given moment. So you're getting it's interesting to get this, because we get, we've had the social context of being part of these communities and stuff like that, and then we're getting even more context for where his design ethos comes from. And, none of this is written in a particularly sort of highfalutin way. It's just, here are the games I played, here's what I thought of them. And yeah, the thing about the arcades is that, arcade games were sort of designed to be potentially beaten in 1 second, one setting. And he talks about how the like really hardcore arcade gamers, they wouldn't put a quarter in to like continue. They would let the time out and then start the game again from scratch, because that made you better at the game.
Yeah.
And it also meant you got to sort of recoup, because if you get to play the easy first level again, then by the time you get back to the hard bit, you're kind of ready. And that's interesting, because that comes, again, just to jump ahead, that comes back much later in the book when he's talking about the hell level. And he talks about, if you've got this kind of game where people are concentrating on the same run of a game for 30 to 40 minutes, you don't necessarily want everything to get smoothly more and more difficult, because the player is getting exhausted, right?
Yeah.
So you maybe want to let them chill out a bit at the end, so you can make the last level as easy or difficult as the first level, and just make this kind of hump early on, where it's like initially, you're going to be struggling to get out of the mines into the jungle, and then you're going to be struggling to finish the jungle. And then after that, it can be maybe more driven by like novelty and seeing different things, because you probably lost most of your lives in the harder part of the game anyway. And that was really interesting to just... It's such a taken for granted idea that a game should just get more difficult in a linear way, or even like in a bumpy way, but continuing up and up all the way through. And thinking of this kind of attention curve and how stressed the player is from playing a long time.
Yeah, I wonder if that sort of comes from the 3-act structure in films, where it's like there's supposed to be like a rise in action and then a climax right at the very end. Whereas, games aren't movies. There's a human that has to do all these things, and, trying to find the exact right moment to sort of turn up the heat on them, but also turn it down again. It's interesting, because I don't think people talk about that all that much in game design circles.
Yeah. Particularly in the context of a run-based game where you're playing the same game for 20 minutes or 40 minutes, and you can't sort of save or checkpoint it, So kind of relevant for things like Vampire Survivors and stuff like that as well, where it's just, you're sitting there playing the same game for 20 minutes. You can't get out of that session once you've started it. And that means you do need to give people a break or some sort of interruption in that,
And if you kind of think of Vampire Survivors like as a good example, you sort of know if you've won a run by the 20-minute mark or not, and then like the last 10 minutes is just sitting there absorbing gems. And
the good stuff. We get these first two sections where he's talking about the kind of basic idea for the game, how it developed, this kind of early interactions on TIGsource with other members of the community, playtesting the game, feeding back on it. We get the kind of formation of his design ethos and where that comes from. And like you said, he doesn't believe the customer or as the player is always right. And it's summarized really nicely here. We can't have everything that we want all at once. We can't know what to expect and also be surprised. We can't be free from frustration and also be challenged. We can't go unchallenged and also feel satisfied with our accomplishments. Mystery, surprise, tension, challenge, and a real sense of accomplishment always come at the cost of feeling uncomfortable. Given the opportunity, many of us would rather take the easier road, but that's usually the less rewarding one. And this sounds a bit like a kind of Dark Souls get good type situation.
Yeah, no, that's a big tattoo. That might have to go on my back.
You're running out of body space. You could have it done in an aubergine, in an eggplant.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is interesting because I remember the first time this occurred to me. I'd been in my 20s. I was playing through the Fable series, and I think it was the second one or the third one. They introduced the breadcrumb trailing in the navigation for the first time. And I don't think it had been in the first one. And I realised that, I'm never getting lost in this game now. And I thought back to earlier 3D kind of exploration adventure games like Tomb Raider and stuff like that. And how the experience of getting lost and then finding your way again was really satisfying, actually. And it's really interesting how the kind of accessibility orthodoxies that we have now about how to help people navigate and stuff sort of take away a type of pleasure. And I'm not even thinking of this as a challenge of like, the Dark Souls type masochism of, you should just get good at this hard thing. It's like, no, it's actually pleasurable to be lost and then find your way again.
Yeah, I think it probably comes out of the sort of, like, I think it's a good design principle, but the idea of like iterating, getting feedback and iterating. But, there's also value in having a vision of what your game should be and, not compromising on that. And I think that's what Derek gets at in a lot of this book. But, in that cycle of iteration, then you can shave off a lot of the hard corners of, what just feels uncomfortable to a player, like, getting lost. But by shaving off the hard edges, you lose something.
Yeah, so we get a kind of breakdown throughout this whole part of, like, when you're playtesting, what are the sorts of things you should take on board? Like, I can't control I literally can't do this press of 3 buttons to do this thing, which could just be 2 buttons. Versus, like, what do you keep in place because it's the heart of the game? And then as he kind of iterates and adds stuff, because we get to the chain in a minute as well, which is really interesting, it's all to do with supporting that core idea of like mystery and secrets and all of this kind of stuff. And so you get the chain added to the game, which is basically this sequence of secrets that you would have to stumble on accidentally or find by reading about on the internet, and then also carry out and sort of slightly at the mercy of the RNG of the game, right? Because some of these secrets involve like bombing a certain area and finding a door, and you might have fallen too far down in the level to find that door and all this kind of stuff. So he sort of creates this meta level goal for the player and the community of finding the better way to play the game, right? And it's definitely not new to Spelunky because we've had like secret endings and stuff for a very long time. And I think like Castlevania was probably the first time I saw this in the 90s, where you had like an end boss and it was like, oh no, actually there's that wasn't the real boss, that was the fake boss, and you were supposed to do this to get the real boss, that kind of thing. So it's that kind of thinking, and that leads to kind of moments of surprise and joy for the player when they accidentally stumble upon it. But it also means that if you're a more kind of online social player, then it's more to do with discussing the kind of strategies with people of how you find this stuff.
Yeah, but I think there's something really elegant about how it's used in a run-like game like Spelunky, where, you can be doing these levels over and over and over again, and, to the point where they feel like very, very familiar, and then all of a sudden you see this thing that you hadn't noticed before, and then that sort of like throws everything that you've done up until that point in a completely new light. Whereas like in some of those older games with like secret bosses, you're playing through the game linearly. I can never say that word. But, if you missed the moment where you had to do this thing to be able to get the secret boss, then, you get to the ending and you'll never know there was something else.
Yeah. It's interesting to think of how that interacts with it being a run-based game where you're doing variations on the same thing over and over and over again, It kind of reminds me a little bit of racing games and stuff like They used to put these like secret routes in a lot of things like downhill, like snowboarding games and stuff like that. Like 1080 snowboarding on the N64 had a bunch of these like secret caves.
Yeah. Oh, what's that? Was Snowboard Kids? It was like another snowboarding game on the 64.
Yeah.
We played those kids with the horrifying cone noses.
Well, aerodynamic.
Yeah.
And yeah, so the kind of first two parts of the book give us all of the story of the kind of original pixel art Spelunky, and then we get into making Spelunky for Xbox Live Arcade, which is the one that I didn't play the one before that. And basically, yeah, we get a pitch to a kind of producer person at Xbox.
Now, was it Phil Spencer?
I think so. And we get a lot of kind of talk about the kind of relationships here. And the idea is to rebuild the game because a game maker game won't port nicely to Xbox. And this is where Jonathan Blow comes in because he's already made Braid. And he basically gives Derek Yu the Braid engine and says, you can use this.
Yep.
And it ends up not getting used. So again, if you ever... this is such a good book of reassurance of like what is normal and what to expect, because like all of these kind of hacky workarounds and then this kind of situation where you start trying to build a game in an engine and then do it for like 6 months or however long and then have to completely reapproach it because it doesn't work. It's just all here, and it's like such a successful game, and it went through so much nonsense. And then he gets a programmer working with him called Andy, who takes on the programming, and they're not even using GitHub. They're like emailing each other zips of the game backwards and forwards.
Yeah, which like you forget like how recent a lot of that sort of version control stuff is. But yeah, like I think this section sort of goes back to that idea of the importance of community, because like he knew Blow through TIGsource. He knew Andy through the click and play community. I think at a certain point he gets on some musicians, which again he sort of met through various forums. It's just the idea of doing creative, or even the pitch itself. Like he had enough of a following and enough sort of sizzle on the game from TIGsource that the pitch was almost a formality. It that idea of just doing creative things around other people is central to this book.
Yeah, it does kind of lead to a few hiccups with making the jump to the console. So one that really stands out is that on TIGsource, everyone there was a massive nerd and could just see what was cool about the project at a glance. And the things that were cool about it weren't as immediately obvious to like higher ups at Xbox or the general console audience or whatever.
Yeah.
And he kind of blames that for maybe the game selling a bit less than some of its contemporaries, because you can't show what's cool about a procedurally generated platform in a trailer very easily.
Yeah. And like I think that's sort of a point, even if it's not the difference between like people in a game development forum and Xbox executives. I think there's like a gap between showing your game to your contemporaries and as game developers and just like a regular player. So going back to playtesting, I think it's important to try and like get in front of civilians as often as possible, because they'll give you different feedback than game developers who will probably be a lot more opinionated in their feedback, and also not necessarily give you the right feedback either.
Yeah. There is, so in terms of the things that were added, so the Xbox Live Arcade version, which is also the version that you would get on Steam now, is kind of in high definition graphics. It's like a painted cartoon style. It has a new soundtrack. The engine was completely rewritten, and then there's like a tutorial that wasn't in the original. We have some like diary entries that were kind of a gentle narrative that weren't in the original. And I think it's a really interesting example of like an iterative project, because those are all things that I think are important for a general audience, but you absolutely don't need them in the first year or two of working on your game, right? Because the people who are going to playtest the game are going to be people who just enjoy the core gameplay and don't need a very intense tutorial or a story or anything like that.
Yeah, and it's the difference between a a freeware game and a product is, if someone stumbles across the freeware version through word of mouth, then they're just happy someone's made something for free that you can,
Yeah.
fire up, and, if it's buggy or, does something weird, then you don't mind. But if you've paid, £15 for a game or however much they were charging for Spelunky back in the day, you need tutorials and polished, menus that you can change the sound and accessibility and all those things, which, take a lot of time, and they're usually the thing that you don't bother with if you're doing a freeware game.
Yeah, exactly. And I've seen people more recently work in that kind of flow where, maybe they do the free version of something over itch, and then if they take that same game and put it on Steam later, it's basically a different version, or it's like a sequel or something like that. And that kind of allows them to sort of identify any really big issues early on. But then, counter to that, I see so many people that are just putting a game on Steam, asking for money for it.
Yeah.
And it's just like, clearly hasn't been playtested by many people. And it's just kind of makes me think, what are you doing?
Yeah, well, I mean, best recent example of that is Vampire Survivors again.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that started its life as like an HTML5 game.
Yeah.
And then, just this little thing published on itch. And then, it's sort of taken over the world, but, it didn't happen overnight.
Yeah, he still went through that process of like, it's respecting people's time and understanding the relative value of the thing you're making, right?
Yeah.
Because if you immediately ask for $10 for something and it's not as good as anything else that people could spend $10 on, then it's like, what are you doing? And I think that's the other thing about design versus art is, design is making things for people. Maybe not for everyone, this book is very much about having a vision and kind of sticking to it. But yeah, just kind of making whatever you want to make without any concern for what other people want, and then expecting people to pay you for it is just delusional.
Yeah.
And I do see quite a lot of that, which is quite surprising.
Yeah. There's a very funny article about Hideo Kojima receiving positive feedback about Death Stranding 2 and being disappointed that it was so positive, and he wanted to make something that was more unpopular.
Yeah, that sounds like him.
Yeah.
So yeah, we get the kind of story, the development story of working together with a programmer on this kind of port that becomes this sort of deluxe version of the game. There's a discussion of achievements in there. Where it's like it's basically roping in some GDC talk about how achievements are bad. Which is like a total just random side dig about how he didn't want to put achievements in the game.
No, well, I mean, again, it's that sort of going from freeware to a polished, product, especially on Xbox, where, it takes time to do those things, and not every game benefits from them.
Yeah.
I remember playing the Silent Hill 2 remake like years ago, and like, really getting into the game, and then, being sucked in by the atmosphere, and then beating this monster to death with a crowbar, and then all of a sudden I get like a little pop-up at the top of the screen saying, you've killed 100 monsters.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, it is...
It's just not the right type of experience to do that with.
Yeah.
It would be like, you're watching a movie, and like you're watching a sort of a David Lynch movie, and it brings up an achievement and says, you saw the dumpster guy.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. I know, I was there. Another character that pops up here is Tom Francis. So Tom Francis made Gunpoint and a couple of games since then. And he is sort of noted as a games journalist at the time. So he's editor for PC Gamer. And he has this wonderful anecdote about the shopkeeper where he goes into this place called the Black Market, which is like a secret shop that has lots of shopkeepers in. And it's this like note of the kind of stuff that can happen if you have this rich system of interactions where everything has very simple rules for how it interacts, but those rules can overlap in certain situations. So it's all 9 shopkeepers hurl themselves into the air and start firing their shotguns in random directions. They kill the tribesman. And this is because there's like a cartoon tribesman that wants to pick up a boomerang.
Yeah.
Do you remember this bit?
Yeah.
And it goes in the shop and it's lost its boomerang, so it picks up a boomerang and it doesn't have a concept of like this belongs to the shopkeeper.
Yeah.
So it picks up the one that's there, leaves the shop, and then the shopkeeper goes mad, jumps around, starts shooting everyone.
Yeah.
And it's such a good example of what happened was the tribesman walked out of the shop. He walked out of the shop with the shopkeeper's boomerang in his hand, and he walked out of the shop without paying for it. So it's that simple set of statements about what is happening in the game that can lead to this really cool emergent thing. And it's funny, you talk about Breath of the Wild earlier, but they designed that all around that, and they were talking about, trying to treat game mechanics as like a chemistry set of like, here are all these interactions that can happen, and if you are either randomly lucky or unlucky or create the situation, like the chickens pecking the goblin to death, that kind of thing, then you can see some really fun stuff. And
if you sort of, for an emergent, procedurally generated game like this, I think that's like a really good way to think of those systems, because they kind of act as a force multiplier on each other. So if you have like two little systems, then that's sort of like two kinds of interactions. But you add another one to that, then that's 6 kinds of interactions you can have, and like each time you do that, you're creating more and more things that can happen in the possibility space of the game.
And the game doesn't have to be procedural to have those qualities, right? It's immersive sims are often built around having these lots of different interactions where it's like, okay, I can shock someone if there's water on the floor, and I can put water on the floor by bringing this thing over here, and all of that kind of stuff. So I don't think people should necessarily see this as being tied to PCG or roguelikes or anything.
No, not at all.
It's just a particular approach to design where you make a kit of toys, and then you worry about how they go together afterwards.
Just small and simple toys. But the more small and simple toys you have, then you can create all kinds of interesting things.
There's a whole section on the music, and how that was kind of upgraded from being chip tunes to this sort of weird mix of live music and everything, which is a kind of what you would expect, really, if you take a game from pixel art to sort of a more traditional cartoon type thing. And there's a whole section here to kind of cap it off on something really, really practically applicable for developers. I think it's not right at the end of the book, but a bit that I think is perhaps really important to think about is this whole section about finishing things and restarting stuff. Because there's actually a article on Yu's blog about this, and he sort of summarizes it here. But it's just about how important it is to finish stuff. And start new things after you finish something, rather than just constantly starting new things.
Yeah, which we were sort of talking a little bit before we started recording, is like how the start of a project is kind of the fun part, because it's a bit of a blank canvas, and it feels like you're making progress a lot faster.
Yes.
Whereas like anyone that's finished a game sort of knows just how hard that last part is, and if you're working on your first project, my advice is just push through it. It's hard, and it'll hurt, but if you get out the other side of it, then you'll be better for it.
Yeah, it's the whole thing about the last 10% taking 90% of the time, right? And as you say, it's like when you're at the end of a project, the things that are left to do are either repetitive, boring things, like just making more assets or polishing something or tweaking very small things over and over and over again, or they're basically things that you don't know how to do and you've been avoiding because they're like you've been avoiding them the whole project because it's like
and the other awful side to that is if you've gotten that far through a project, it probably means you're a creative person, which means you've probably got 100 other ideas for other things that you want to do, and don't resist that urge, fight through it.
And this kind of, I mean, this isn't explicitly there in the book, but I think if you take the kind of narrative as a whole, this kind of ties back to the collaboration and community angle again, because he's at this point, it's his game, he's made the game previously, it's being remade, he has the vision for the game and most of what it is, he's the designer, he's the artist, someone else is programming it, but even just that interaction of working with someone else is kind of forcing you through the project in a way that working on your own might not. And then he's got a producer called Kevin at Xbox, and he talks about what makes him a good producer, because he sort of lets them get on with it, but can see the areas where they get stuck on one thing or whatever. And yeah, just this, I think the idea of being forced to finish because other people are relying on you in some way, you know?
Yeah, and similarly for the community, if you've been sharing your progress with other people and there's people that are excited to see your game, that's a huge motivating factor as well.
Yeah, so it's why I can. Yeah, when people kind of are really secretive about what they're doing and don't want to share it, it's like, well, you're going to need other people behind your game if you want to finish it and if you want anyone to care about it, you know.
Yeah, and it'll build your confidence as well. Like, you know, I think people can often be resistant to sharing what they're doing because, you know, it's half-baked and a little bit crap at that point. But if you're in a community of people that are all making things that are half-baked and a little bit crap at the moment, then you know, you're all in the same boat and you can sort of, you know, see what each other are trying to get to.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, actually. It's like there's it can be very daunting when you start making games because you are entering as a gamer, right? So all your expectations come from that space. And I remember the first year that we used to, the kind of course I used to run, the first year we took our students to Amaze in Berlin, which is like this digital arts conference type thing. And we got them to show the games they were working on, even though they were like broken little games, because it was going to be an audience of like artists and other game developers. But I think if we would go into like a local gaming convention with like COD kids, never would have made them do that, because they would have just got rinsed, because they're just like, why does your game made of squares? So like starting off in communities of sort of fellow travelers who are doing the same sort of thing means that you kind of get this initial softer approach of people who can see what you're doing, they can see what you're going for, and instead of just saying, I think you should add multiplayer, I think you should make it an MMO, they will actually be able to kind of give reasonable responses to what you're doing.
Yeah, and you know, even if you leave the indie space and go to like an actual studio, like those little half-baked things are still useful for your portfolio, and when you're showing them to people, like that's interesting for employers to see. Yeah,
totally. And like the other thing about this game, I mean, it's not just one game, is it? Really, it's several pieces of software. It's another thing it's reminding me of is that you can iterate and finish a small project and literally put it out and say, I'm done with that, and then come back to it later and make something that is a sequel or whatever that is more what you would have wanted to do the first time round. And the kind of art upgrade, whether you see it as an upgrade or not, is a good example of that. And I think of other games where it's like Risk of Rain.
Yeah.
They did like a pixel art game first, and then the sequel was a totally different like 3D game. It's in the same world, it's the same lore. And I think the more examples people see of that sort of thing, the easier it is to scope down and do something reasonable, because you can go, right, I would like this to have 100 paintings in and 50 pieces of music, but maybe that can just be the second one, you know? I'm sure there's lots of people that have worked on sequels where the style and the quality of the second one is what they wanted to do in the first one, but they had to just be realistic and do what they could at the time, you know?
Yeah, and, you know, there's plenty, like, this is sort of survivor bias playing in a little bit. These are successful games we're talking about. A lot of the time you'll release a game and no one will care, and, you know, the faster you can get to that point and you can go, okay, well, you know, this is the one people wanted, I can do something completely new now, and you're sort of freed from that burden. So yeah, I think do what you can to finish the game as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, because you can always just make another version of it.
Yeah.
There's one little, I mean, there's so many interesting little anecdotes in here that we can't really go through them all in the time, but one I've got here, I was talking to the composer about the hidden track. So there's a secret track, and there's like a whole script of the conversation between Derek and Eric, he's called, and they're talking about what things should trigger this And spoiler alert, it links into the whole eggplant mystery. And the bit that I highlighted was Eric saying, "Oh, you should hold a damsel while standing on an altar and then let the ghost get you. Then wait 4 minutes on the game over screen." And then Derek says, "Nah, too easy." And this bit made me laugh, but it also feels quite insightful because it shows how like even the composer was very invested in the gameplay and understood how this game worked. And like, I don't know, you've worked in commercial studios, I've worked in commercial studios, I've definitely worked in studios where, you know, people that were not involved in the game mechanics did not really care about the game at all. Like artists in particular, they just get asked to draw something and then they draw it and then you go, "Oh, well, actually, this is supposed to be interactable, so it needs this kind of outline," and they just, whatever, just give me a brief and I'll draw something. It was very refreshing to hear just like someone who could be very peripheral, like a composer, just trying to workshop ideas for this weird game mechanic.
Which I think speaks to like the love that people have for this game. It's like everyone that seemed to touch it, wanted to, leave a mark on it however they could. And
so I think we've been through a lot of the kind of key things people can learn from this book. There's still a lot of stuff that we haven't been through in massive detail because I think a lot of it is just interesting stuff about the project, and you should kind of read it if you want to know about that. Thank you for picking this one. I thought it was a good one to go with first on the podcast because, as you say, it's a book by the designer, but the designer is also the programmer, so you get a little bit of how things work under the hood.
No, I just think more than anything, it's just a very inspirational book. Like reading it, you just want to go out and make games. So I really recommend people pick it up if they can find it.
Yeah, I think I had to get mine off eBay. I don't think there are new ones. I also wanted to go with a book by a sort of quote unquote successful designer first because I know there are people that sort of think that you can't learn anything good about games from books. Or the attitude I've seen float around is that game design theory is often too abstract, and I think that's true in some cases. I think books like sort of Jesse Schell's Deck of Lenses and stuff like that are very good books, but if it was like the first thing you read about game design,
you kind of think that's what the rules of game design is.
And it's like there's this problem, isn't where it's you either go really broad like that book, which everything in that book could be applied to a video game, it could be applied to a board game, it could be applied to making an interactive ride at Disneyland, which is one of the things that Jesse Schell worked on. But if you're like looking for practical advice, it's maybe not so helpful. And then something like this, it's like you might pick this book up initially and think it's going to be more relevant if you're trying to make a platformer, or more relevant if you're trying to make a roguelike or something like that. But I think the things that are really helpful from this is sort of understanding that this is what it's like for a designer to kind of develop an ethos and then express that through the game they make,
No, it's I think like you said with books like Lenses, coming to it fresh, you could fall into the trap that like there's a science of design, whereas like this feels like it's the story of one scrappy bedroom programmer that has opinions on games, and this is how he applied his opinion to make this really interesting product.
And it's I think everyone has opinions about games that they want to express through making a game, whether they can do it or not. But the kind of approach to, like the Miyamoto quote, right, of you sit with these problems of like, okay, I've got these 4 problems at the moment. And you don't rush to solve them until you find the way that solves 3 or 4 of them at once. And then you go, aha! And that's why it's so important to not always just be hands on the keyboard, right? Because I think, particularly when you're in the early stages of learning a game engine and learning to program, it is beneficial to be spending as much time as you can on it. But that doesn't necessarily lead to good design decisions. It just leads to lots and lots of lines of code being written, right? And often what you actually need to be doing is walking in a park for an hour.
Yeah, well, like my side project, which I'd sort of been very diligently working on for like, a couple of years at this point. I went on a trip last month and couldn't work on it. And, I've come back to it with fresh eyes, and there's a whole bunch of design changes I want to make to it because, I was trying to like, basically force my way through them. Whereas, I need to step back and go, okay, well, let's list out all the things I'm not happy with and like what's the fewest changes I can make that sort of fix those.
Yeah. Yeah. So, listeners at home, hope you found this interesting. Do you have anything you want to plug, Tom? Tell people about the game a little bit more?
Yeah, I'm working on a game called Castle Croak. It's a mobile artillery game. It's got a lot of shared DNA with like the Worm series and Gunbound.
Scorched Earth.
Scorched Earth, yeah. But, uniquely for mobile. But it's a side project. I work on it when I can, so I'd love to get it out this year, but, I'm not putting that pressure on myself.
Yeah. It might show up on my YouTube channel at some point, but I've sworn off mobile games at the moment just because getting them to stream to OBS while you're recording is hell.
Yeah, not streamer friendly.
Yeah, I had a playtest with you a couple of months ago, and it's a very funny little game. It's like streamlined compared to Worms because you got less weapons and stuff, but it's got this art style that's very reminiscent of like Behemoth games like Castle Crashers and Alien Hominid and stuff like that. It's sort of
again,
goofy flash kind of.
Yeah, going back to Spelunky, like that's sort of the moment that I came up in games. It was that moment of time where Newgrounds was where like all the really interesting stuff was happening. So I can't take that part of my DNA out now.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Game Developers Library. We will be back at roughly a monthly cadence to start off with. And just like the Indie Game Clinic YouTube channel, this is one of the things that is supported by the Indie Game Clinic Patreon. So if you want to hear or see more stuff like this, then please subscribe to the Patreon. That also gives you access to our Discord, where you can come and pester us about game development and post about your projects and organize playtests and all of that kind of stuff. So I've been working on this community or with this community for the past year, trying to create a cool space for people who are making games and maybe want to operate in a maybe bit more of a closed environment, because places like Facebook and Reddit just tend to be lots of spam happening all the time. So if that sounds appealing to you, then do check it out, because most people who are there are getting a decent amount of value out of that. Do you have any closing advice for people about making games?
Find a community. The Indie Games Clinic community is a pretty damn good one.
It doesn't have to be our community. You can probably find one that you don't have to pay for. And I mean, one of the things I would say is if there's not a club local to you for the thing that you want to do, then maybe just be the person that starts that club.
Yeah.
I often hear people say it's really hard. I'll give people playtesting advice and say, you should watch your playtests, don't just wait for feedback and see what people say. You should watch someone play your game. I can't get anyone to. There will be other people that want to make games in a 20-mile radius that will make a little game dev club with you and meet up and play your games,
Like, we live in a little town in East Kent. It's, you can find game developers everywhere. And, it doesn't have to be like a transactional relationship either. Like, they're people that, like, you'll probably have the same interests, so you'll end up being friends, hang out, have a broad range of interests.
Break each other's games, find all the bugs, all of that kind of stuff. So, I mean, there was a lot in this book about community and kind of building collaborative relationships and stuff like that. So, like you said earlier on, it's a really good counter-narrative to the idea of, like, all of these indie devs just being sort of genius loners kind of thing, because there aren't many people that are actually like that, and when we get stories of that kind of thing, they tend to be sort of romanticizations and not really what was going on, Thank you very much.
No, thanks for having me.
I don't have a catchphrase or sign off for this yet, so I'm just gonna improvise one right now. it's going to be read books. Books are good. But if you can't read books, then listen to podcasts about books, because that's nearly as good.
Great tattoo.
Amazing. Thanks. If you're interested in joining our Discord community or just supporting the creation of this show and other stuff I do on Indie Game Clinic over on YouTube, then please do check out the Patreon. It's patreon.com/Indie Game Clinic. Thanks for listening and good luck with your games.